His boarding pass was valid. His badge cleared him. His name was printed in bold letters across the slip of paper. Yet still, Marcus Wright was told to stand up. "Sir, you'll need to move. That seat is reserved." The hostess's words cut through the polished silence of the VIP lounge at Reagan National Airport. Marcus looked down at his pass again, slow and deliberate, as if the letters might suddenly rearrange themselves. But no, they spelled his name. Clear, undeniable. And yet, here he was, a black man in a tailored Navy suit, one of the most powerful CEOs in America, being asked to leave a chair he had every right to occupy. Before he could respond, the second blow landed. The white businessman in the gray suit strolled in, not a glance in Marcus's direction. With casual arrogance, he sank into the very seat Marcus was forced to vacate. He smirked, stretching out as though the lounge itself existed for him alone. The room fell silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but hums with humiliation and unspoken bias. Marcus displaced the smirk of entitlement. The lounge watched. Some looked away, others leaned in. No one spoke. And here's the question for you. If this happened to you, in front of strangers, in a room that promised discretion and experience, would you have stood quietly or would you have spoken up? Marcus didn't argue. Not a single word. He simply rose, steady and calm, his expression unreadable. But don't mistake his silence for weakness. This silence had weight. It pressed into the room, leaving even the air feeling heavy. Think about it. A man at the top of his field, leading one of the largest tech companies in Washington, D.C., standing as if stripped of dignity in seconds. How many times do we hear that success, power, and money shield you from racism? And yet, in that lounge, in that moment, none of it mattered. The businessman crossed his leg, tapping his polished shoe against the table. The hostess adjusted her blazer, avoiding Marcus's eyes. Others glanced down at their phones, pretending not to witness the insult that played out inches from them. But people were watching, and deep down, they knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't about operational necessity. It wasn't about random seating rules. It was about perception, who looks like they belong and who doesn't. Marcus paused, scanning the room. Every face seemed to carry the same quiet question. Would he fight back, or would he swallow the insult? And that pause, long, intentional, kept the room suspended like a held breath. Then, in a move so understated it almost slipped by, Marcus reached into his pocket. He pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered, then tapped once, twice. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't even frowning. He was simply deliberate. Now tell me, what happens when a man who built an empire stays calm, while the world tries to humiliate him? The businessman leaned back, satisfied, the picture of arrogance. But he had no idea the ground beneath him had already shifted. No one in that room did. And Marcus? He simply lowered himself into a chair nearby, phone resting in his palm, his eyes fixed on a man who thought he'd won. The stage was set, but none of them, not the hostess, not the passengers, not even the smug man in gray, understood what was about to unfold. Because sometimes the most dangerous sound isn't a raised voice. It's silence. And that silence was about to be broken. The staff at the lounge desk suddenly received a message that froze their smiles in place. One by one, their faces shifted from composed to pale, from smug to shaken. The room didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had just started to crack. Marcus Wright wasn't just another man waiting in a lounge chair. He was the kind of figure who made headlines without ever asking for attention. The kind of man people read about in glossy business magazines, shaking hands with world leaders, announcing billion-dollar deals. Yet in that moment, when a hostess leaned down and told him to move, none of it seemed to matter. His power, his money, his status, all invisible in the eyes of those who saw only his skin first. But before the humiliation, there was a journey. Marcus had grown up in a cramped apartment in southeast D.C., where the sound of sirens was as common as the hum of the refrigerator. He learned early that respect wasn't handed out. It had to be claimed. His mother cleaned offices. His father drove buses. They told him education was his way out. But what they really gave him was grit, the kind that doesn't fade when doors slam in your face. He excelled in school, not because it was easy, but because failure was not an option. At Howard, he studied computer science, often being the only black face in advanced tech seminars. The stares followed him then too, doubt, curiosity, disbelief. But he kept coding, kept building, until one of his projects caught fire. That project became a company. That company grew into one of the most powerful tech firms in Washington, and Marcus became its CEO. Now, you might think reaching that level would insulate a man. That billion-dollar contracts and boardroom clout would shield him from the little cuts of everyday bias. But here's the truth. Money doesn't rewrite perception. In elite spaces, prejudice wears a tailored suit. It speaks softly with words like Operation Necessity or Random Policy. It smiles while moving you out of the chair you already paid for. That's what makes Marcus's story sting. He wasn't just anyone told to give up his seat. He was proof that no matter how high you climb, someone will still look down on you if they believe they can. And that's why people root for him, not just because he's wealthy, but because he carries the weight of every person who has ever been told, "You don't belong here." Yet Marcus never wore his power loudly. He believed in discretion, in letting results speak louder than arguments. He wasn't a man of outbursts. He was a man of timing, the same timing that would later turn humiliation into history. And here's where the tension deepens. Marcus wasn't just sitting in that lounge for comfort. He was on his way to finalize an international deal, one that could change the direction of his company forever. That seat wasn't just a leather cushion. It was part of a routine that kept him focused, grounded, ready. To take it from him wasn't just about comfort. It was about dignity. So the question lingers. If someone can strip you of dignity in public, what else are they willing to take? And as Marcus adjusted his cufflinks and quietly set his phone on the table, none of the passengers around him had the faintest idea who he really was, or what was about to unfold. Because the next time his phone lit up, the entire lounge would feel the consequences. The VIP lounge at Reagan National Airport was dressed in luxury. Polished marble floors, glass walls, muted lighting that made every shadow look deliberate. But beneath that polished surface, something else moved. A quiet charge, the kind of electricity you feel before a storm. Marcus Wright sat there with his boarding pass in hand, his company badge tucked neatly inside his blazer, when a hostess leaned down and whispered, "Sir, you'll need to move. That seat is reserved." Her tone was smooth, rehearsed, wrapped in the language of operational necessity. But her eyes told a different story. They weren't questioning the ticket in his hand. They were questioning him. Around him, silence spread. Other passengers pretended to scroll their phones, but their eyes flicked sideways. One woman adjusted her pearls and whispered something to the man beside her, covering her mouth as if discretion could hide the smirk behind it. A younger man with AirPods half smiled, as if he had seen the scene play out before and already knew the ending. Marcus's name was printed clearly on the ticket. His company had paid for this seat, for the access, for the luxury. Yet here he was, displaced not by policy, but by perception. In that room, his success wasn't the first thing people saw. His skin was. And here's where the silence cut sharpest. No one spoke up. Not a single passenger, not a single voice. The lounge was filled with people who worked in boardrooms, who gave speeches about fairness and diversity. Yet in this polished, exclusive corner of the airport, all their values seemed to vanish. They watched in discretion, as though their silence was an experience they had paid for. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood. But standing didn't soften the insult. It magnified it. The sound of the businessman's shoes clicking across the floor as he walked toward Marcus's seat echoed like a verdict. The smirk on his face stretched wider as he slid into that chair, legs crossed, hands clasped as if he had claimed a throne. And the room, it froze in complicity. The whispers faded, but the stares grew sharper. Everyone was waiting to see how Marcus would respond. Would he fight back? Would he walk away? Or would he endure? Another man forced to carry dignity through quiet humiliation? You've been in that moment before, haven't you? Watching something wrong unfold, wondering if you should speak up, and choosing silence? But here's the question. What happens when a man they push aside has more power than anyone in the room imagines? Because in the next heartbeat, Marcus reached into his pocket. His hand didn't tremble. His face didn't shift. He pulled out his phone, unlocked it with one smooth swipe, and typed a single line. And that's when the atmosphere changed. Not because of what he said, but because of what was about to happen next. He walked in like he owned the room. Tall, crisp gray suit, leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's rent. His shoes clicked against the marble floor with a rhythm that demanded attention. And the moment his eyes landed on Marcus's seat, the one by the window, he didn't hesitate. He didn't even glance at Marcus, as if Marcus wasn't there at all. That's when the hostess leaned forward, lowering her voice with that corporate tone dressed in politeness. "Sir, you'll need to move. That seat is reserved." Reserved for the man in gray. The businessman didn't bother to thank her. He smirked instead, a small curl of the lip that carried more insult than words ever could. He set his briefcase down slowly, almost theatrically, as though the chair was his throne, and this moment his coronation. Every gesture screamed entitlement, like the lounge itself was built for him and men like him. Marcus stood quietly, his boarding pass still in hand, his dignity intact though the sting was sharp. He had every right to stay, but the room already decided who deserved comfort and who didn't, and the businessman knew it. That's why he leaned back, legs crossed, watching Marcus with a casual arrogance that said, "I belong. You don't." The lounge wasn't just quiet. It was complicit. People saw what happened, but silence reigned. Some lowered their eyes to their phones, pretending to scroll. Others whispered, as if racism wrapped in operational necessity was just part of the VIP experience. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged it. And here's the part that cut deepest. This man wasn't simply a passenger. He was the embodiment of elitism, a living symbol of how prejudice survives in polished places. He didn't need to insult Marcus directly. His smirk, his posture, his casual dismissal did the work for him. Marcus remained calm, his expression unreadable, but that calm didn't erase the humiliation. Viewers can feel it. You probably felt it too. That moment when someone looks at you and decides, without saying a word, that you don't measure up. The businessman's arrogance wasn't personal. It was systemic. He was performing for the room, secure in the knowledge that no one would call him out. And for a moment, it looked like he was right. But arrogance has a way of blinding men to the storm building in silence. What he couldn't see, what no one in that lounge could see yet, was that Marcus Wright wasn't just another passenger giving up a chair. He was a man who carried more power in his pocket than anyone in that room could imagine. And as the businessman leaned back with that smug grin, sipping water from a crystal glass like victory was already his, Marcus adjusted his cufflinks and lowered his gaze to the phone in his hand. The businessman thought he had claimed the seat, but what he had really done was trigger something far bigger. Because Marcus wasn't finished. He was just getting started. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't even remind the hostess that his name was on the boarding pass in her hand. Instead, he rose slowly, almost too slowly, as if he wanted everyone in that polished lounge to feel every second of the insult. His silence was heavier than any outburst could have been. Because here was the truth. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is the deepest kind of rage, the kind that waits and watches. But in that moment, to the room, it looked like surrender. The businessman in the gray suit leaned back comfortably, stretching out his legs like a king who just claimed new territory. His smirk said everything, you see? Even here, in the so-called equal spaces, you don't belong. The other passengers saw it too. A few exchanged glances, but none of them spoke up. Not one person challenged what had just happened. The hostess moved on quickly, straightening her blazer, hiding behind the word she had used earlier, reserved. A word that felt like a blade dressed in velvet. Marcus stood near the corner, hands folded, his face unreadable. The room assumed he had accepted defeat. But inside, something else was happening. He was measuring, watching, deciding. And isn't that the cruelest part? That even when a black man has built empires, climbed ladders, broken ceilings, he can still be told, with a smile, that he doesn't deserve a seat, that his presence is conditional, his luxury negotiable, his dignity disposable. You might wonder, why didn't he say something? Why not speak out right there? But think about it. How many times have you swallowed your pride because you knew the room wasn't built to hear your truth? Because you knew anger would only make you the villain in their eyes? That was Marcus in that moment. Quiet, calm, humiliated, yes, but not defeated. He shifted his weight, adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket, and let the silence speak louder than words. The businessman thought the silence meant weakness. The hostess thought it meant compliance. The passengers thought it meant resignation. But silence has layers. And this particular silence, was dangerous. The air in the lounge thickened. You could almost hear the unspoken thoughts buzzing under the marble floors and soft leather chairs. Marcus's eyes flicked down his phone, just for a second, before he looked back up. That glance was small. So small that most people missed it. But it was enough to signal what the businessman, the hostess, and the silent passengers could not yet imagine. Because Marcus wasn't done. Not even close. The sound in the lounge seemed to disappear the moment Marcus rose from the seat. Glasses clinked in the distance. But here, in this polished corner of privilege, every breath fell heavy. People shifted in their chairs, pretending to look at their tablets or papers, but their eyes kept darting back. They had all seen it. A man with the right badge, the right boarding pass, told to move simply because someone else wanted what was his. The businessman in the gray suit leaned back, legs crossed, a smug smirk carved into his face, as though this scene had been staged for his amusement. The hostess smoothed her uniform with shaky hands, but she didn't look at Marcus anymore. It was as if pushing him aside had erased him from the room. But he wasn't gone. He was still there, tall, calm, and silent, standing in the middle of the lounge where silence burned hotter than words ever could. He didn't shout. He didn't point. He didn't ask anyone to take his side. His presence alone was enough to unsettle the air. The hum of injustice was louder than the airport announcements echoing faintly through the walls. Some passengers glanced away, pretending to be busy, while others couldn't stop watching, shame flickering in their eyes. Everyone knew what had just happened was wrong, but no one dared to speak. And that was the cruelest part. Marcus's silence was not weakness. It was something sharper, something no one could quite name yet. He reached slowly into his pocket, his movements deliberate, calculated. The businessman barely noticed, already whispering into his phone like a king addressing his court. But the rest of the room noticed. The simple act of Marcus pulling out his phone felt like the beginning of something dangerous, something no one wanted to admit they were curious to see. His thumb moved quickly, his eyes steady on the screen. No sound, no expression, just a single line of text that disappeared as soon as it was sent. To everyone else, it looked ordinary, but the stillness in his face made it feel like a loaded trigger had just been pulled. The lounge seemed to tighten, as though the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Whispers crawled through the air. Who is he texting? What is he planning? But no one dared ask out loud. Even the hostess, who had just told him to move, glanced nervously toward the front desk, as if she could already feel something shifting beneath her feet. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket with the same calm he had stood up with. He didn't look angry, but that was the strangest part. Because if humiliation didn't shake him, then something else must have been waiting. Every second stretched. The businessman chuckled at a message on his phone, oblivious of the fact that another clock had already started ticking. Passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity trapped somewhere between fear and anticipation. And then Marcus sat down again, not in some corner, not in another chair. He lowered himself right back into the seat they had taken from him. The entire room froze with him. The businessman's smirk faltered just slightly. The hostess swallowed hard, glancing toward the front desk again. No one knew what was about to happen, but they all knew this. Marcus wasn't finished. And just as the silence became unbearable, a voice crackled over the lounge intercom. "Will the front desk staff please report immediately?" The hostess stiffened, her face drained of color. The room had been silent before. Now it was suffocating. Marcus didn't move. He didn't smile. He only folded his hands calmly, as though this was the very moment he had been waiting for. What happened next would flip the entire room upside down. Marcus's fingers barely moved, But that single motion changed the room. He pulled out his phone, typed one short line, and pressed send. No anger on his face, no trembling in his hands. Just quiet precision. A man who had been told to move like he was disposable now made the first move that would flip everything. The lounge, polished and perfect only minutes ago, felt heavy. Silence carried weight. The businessman in the gray suit reclined deeper into Marcus's stolen chair, crossing his legs like a king. The hostess who had told Marcus to stand straight in her blazer, her chin lifted with false confidence. They thought the humiliation was done. They thought the story ended here. But power doesn't always speak with volume. Sometimes it whispers through the right message at the right time. 3 minutes later, the calm broke. A uniformed supervisor appeared at the entrance, scanning the room with tight eyes. His voice carried authority. "Can I see the following staff at the desk, please?" He called the names of the hostess, another attendant behind the counter, and a floor manager. The room shifted instantly. Conversations dropped, coffee cups froze midair, and the businessman lowered his smirk for just a second, confused at the sudden disruption. The 3 staff walked toward the desk with forced poise, but their steps were stiff, mechanical. They returned moments later, and their faces had changed. The arrogance drained out of them like air from a punctured balloon. One of them glanced back at Marcus, her lips twitching as if she wanted to explain, but no words came. Whispers rushed through the lounge like wildfire. A man near the window leaned forward and muttered, "Wait, he's the CEO of," but stopped himself as though speaking aloud might get him involved in something bigger than he could handle. Eyes darted between Marcus and the trembling staff. Then it happened. The supervisor, voice flat with discretion and operational necessity, asked the staff to step aside. Security, quiet but firm, entered the room and escorted them toward the back. No yelling, no protest, just a sound of polished shoes scraping against polished floor. The hostess, the same one who whispered to Marcus that he didn't belong, kept her face forward, but her hands betrayed her, shaking at her sides. The manager's jaw tightened until it almost cracked. The other attendant whispered under her breath, "This can't be real," as she disappeared behind the glass doors. And Marcus? He didn't even look up from his phone. No smirk, no visible pride. He simply sat back in his rightful seat, the same chair they said was reserved. The same chair they said he couldn't have. The entire lounge now stared, not at the businessman, not at the empty counter, but at the quiet black man whose silence had just spoken louder than any protest could. The humiliation they thought would crush him had just crushed the staff instead. But what about the businessman still sitting across from him, still confident, still untouched? He adjusted his cufflinks and muttered, "None of this changes anything." Oh, but it did. And what happened next would prove just how wrong he was. The lounge didn't know it yet, but Marcus's first message wasn't the only one he sent. The room had barely settled when the 3 staff members were let out, their polished uniforms now nothing more than costumes stripped of meaning. You could almost hear the collective gasp ripple across the lounge. Some passengers covered their mouths. Others exchanged sharp glances, but no one dared to speak above a whisper. The same people who had looked at Marcus as if he didn't belong were now watching him reclaim the very seat they had tried to erase him from. And it wasn't loud. That was the unsettling part. Justice didn't roar in that moment. It whispered. Marcus lowered himself back into the leather chair they told him was reserved, his movements slow, deliberate, almost like he was teaching the room a lesson without saying a word. The chair hissed under his weight, as if even the furniture understood it had been wrong. One passenger, a woman with diamond earrings that caught the fluorescent light, couldn't hide the small, almost guilty smile tugging at her lips. Another man shifted in his seat, his newspaper trembling slightly, not from the air conditioning but from nerves. The arrogance in the lounge had cracked, and everyone felt it. But here's the question that lingers, and I want you to sit with it. If that were you, humiliated in front of strangers, pushed aside because of your skin, then handed the power to decide their fate, would you forgive or would you fire? That's not just a question about Marcus. It's a question about dignity, about patience, about how long someone should have to swallow injustice before finally spitting it out. The silence in the lounge wasn't just about shock. It was about guilt. Some of them had watched it happen and said nothing. They had seen the microaggressions, the smirks, the whispers, but stayed seated, pretending it was none of their business. And now, seeing Marcus calmly take back his place, they had to reckon with their own silence. Yet, while the staff were gone and Marcus was back in his seat, the story wasn't over. In fact, the air grew heavier, like everyone sensed the real storm hadn't even started. Because one man in the room wasn't shaken. One man still smirked, still lounged in false confidence, as if none of this had anything to do with him. And that man was about to make a move that would test just how far Marcus's hidden power could reach. The lounge was still buzzing in silence. That strange kind of silence where everyone wants to talk, but fear keeps their mouth shut. 3 staff were gone. Marcus was back in his seat. Justice had been served, at least in part. But across from him, the gray-suited businessman leaned back with the same smirk, the kind of smirk that said he thought he was immune. He didn't flinch when the staff were escorted out. He didn't shift when whispers filled the air. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket pocket, like a man in no hurry, like someone who still believed he owned the room. Out came his phone, polished and slim, and he tilted it toward his lips. His voice dropped to a low murmur, but not low enough to hide the arrogance. "Yeah, I need to make a call. Get this cleaned up. Discretion, you know." The word hung heavy, a corporate shield tossed casually into the air. Discretion, that coded word people in power use when they're about to cover tracks, silence complaints, or bend rules to their side. He said it like he had done it before. Like this wasn't the first time he had snapped his fingers and watched others fall in line. A woman 2 rows over frowned, shifting in her chair. She whispered to the man beside her, "Does he really think he can still spin this?" The man only shrugged, his eyes flicking nervously toward Marcus, then back to the businessman. Marcus stayed still. He didn't reach for his phone again. He didn't interrupt. He simply let the man talk. That silence, that calm, was louder than any confrontation. The businessman chuckled under his breath, pressing the phone tighter to his ear. "No, I'm not worried. I've got connections." This was operational necessity. They'll see it that way. Random assignment. Nothing more. "Don't worry, I'll handle it." Operational necessity. Random. More words that turn injustice into policy, arrogance into paperwork. He said them with confidence, as if he had the whole system at his fingertips. As if Marcus was just another inconvenience he could push off the board. The passengers could feel the tension shift again. Some leaned forward, their eyes darting between Marcus and the man. Would Marcus speak? Would he let this one pass? Or was there still another storm waiting, silent but sharp? Because here's the truth. Humiliation had already been reversed once tonight. But arrogance? Arrogance doesn't die easily. It lingers. It digs in its heels. And sometimes it forces a second reckoning. Marcus finally looked up. His gaze locked on the businessman, calm, unshaken, almost curious. And in that locked stare, the room felt it. Something bigger was about to drop. The businessman's phone buzzed with an incoming call, but the name on the screen made his smirk disappear. The businessman leaned back, phone pressed to his ear, still smirking as if the entire lounge existed for his comfort. His confidence dripped with the same words he had used before: discretion, necessity, random. Words that turned arrogance into policy, prejudice into procedure. He chuckled softly, whispering, "Don't worry, I've got this handled." And that's when Marcus finally moved. Not loud, not angry, just steady. He turned his head, looked the man dead in the eye, and spoke with a voice so calm it froze the air. "You don't work here anymore either." The businessman blinked. For the first time all night, the smirk vanished. He lowered the phone slowly, confusion clouding his face. "Excuse me?" His tone wasn't arrogant now. It was cautious, edged with something close to fear. The lounge went silent again, but this silence felt different. Heavier. Every eye turned toward Marcus. A man who had been humiliated minutes earlier was now speaking like someone holding the strings. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his posture unshaken. "You think your calls matter. You think your connections protect you. But you forgot one thing. I'm not just a guest here. I'm the majority investor in the airline group that owns this lounge." The words dropped like stone, into still water. Ripples of shock spread across the room. Some passengers gasped audibly. A woman in the corner covered her mouth with her hand. A man whispered, "Wait, and then cut himself off, stunned. The businessman's face flushed red, then pale. He stammered, "No, this is—" But the words collapsed in his throat. All that arrogance, all that certainty, evaporated in seconds. His phone buzzed in his hand, but he didn't dare look at it. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or wave his status like a weapon. He just let the truth sit there, undeniable. Power had shifted, and the businessman knew it. The same system he thought would protect him had turned. And here's the thing about arrogance. It never prepares for exposure. It counts on silence, on people staying in their place. But tonight, silence had been broken. The businessman tried one last offense, leaning forward, his voice sharp. This is a mistake. You don't understand who I am." Marcus met his gaze, calm as ever. "I understand exactly who you are. That's why you're finished." The lounge seemed to exhale all at once. Some people looked away, unable to meet the weight of the moment. Others leaned in, hungry to witness the fall of a man who had walked in with entitlement and was now crumbling under truth. Passengers whispered about Marcus, about his company, his investments, his quiet authority. It wasn't just wealth. It was ownership, control, the kind that couldn't be erased by prejudice or hidden behind policy words. The businessman slumped back, still gripping his phone, as if clinging to it might restore his status. But everyone in that room knew his calls meant nothing now. His connections couldn't save him. And then, just as the silence stretched to its breaking point, a sharp sound cut through, the loud crack of the businessman's phone dropping onto the glass table. It slipped from his shaking hand, screen flashing bright with a single message. Every passenger close enough could see it. And the name glowing on that screen, it wasn't a friend. It wasn't a lifeline. It was Marcus Wright's own executive office. The room froze again. If Marcus's words had been the storm, this was a lightning strike. The silence in the lounge was no longer tense. It was crushing. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the room as the businessman's smirk dissolved into confusion, then disbelief, and finally, fear. The same man who had strutted in with entitlement now looked like a cornered animal searching for a way out. His hand twitched toward his phone, but everyone knew it was too late. No call, no connection, no influence could save him. Every eye in the lounge turned on him, the way passengers turn on turbulence. Suddenly alert, suddenly unsettled. Some looked embarrassed for him. Others quietly satisfied, as if justice had arrived without being summoned. The staff who had once stood so confidently behind him now stood frozen, realizing that their alliance had been with the wrong man all along. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His calm presence filled the room more than shouting ever could. He sat back in his rightful seat, his posture steady, his gaze level. This was not the reaction people expected. They anticipated anger, gloating, maybe even revenge shouted across the lounge. Instead, Marcus showed something more powerful, control. The businessman's lips parted as if protest, but no sound came out. The humiliation was sharper than words. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about dignity stripped and dignity restored. The very chair he had stolen had become his stage of disgrace. Imagine being in that room, watching a man who believed he owned the world suddenly realize he owned nothing here. That's what made the air so heavy. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, hungry for every second of the reversal. And Marcus? He didn't gloat. He didn't even smirk. His silence was the loudest sound in the room. It told the story better than any argument. That real power doesn't need to announce itself. It reveals itself. But there's another layer here. What do you think those passengers were really feeling? Relief? Vindication? Or fear? Fear that they, too, had judged Marcus before they knew who he was? Because let's be honest, many had watched him push aside without speaking up. They let prejudice play out, quietly complicit in the humiliation. And now, watching the tables turn, they had to sit with their silence. The businessman's face flushed red. He reached again for his phone, but his hand shook. He was exposed, naked in a way that had nothing to do with clothing and everything to do with power stripped bare. He had lost the invisible armor of whiteness and status, and all that remained was his arrogance, now cracked open for everyone to see. One passenger coughed nervously. Another whispered, "I can't believe this." The room wasn't just frozen, it was transformed. What had started as Marcus's humiliation had become the businessman's public downfall. And yet, Marcus still said nothing. That was the brilliance. His power was not in crushing a man with words, but in letting him crumble under the weight of his own entitlement. This was the emotional payoff for every second the audience had held their breath during Marcus's humiliation. He had reclaimed not just his seat, but the respect he was always owed. But here's the question I want you to sit with. When the businessman finally found his voice, what would he dare to say? Marcus had reclaimed his seat, his dignity, and the entire room's silence. But let's pause here, because this story was never just about one chair and one lounge. What happened in that polished airport corner is part of a much bigger truth, one that stretches far beyond Marcus Wright. Think about it. If a man like Marcus, a black CO, wealthy, accomplished, respected, could be told, without hesitation, that he didn't belong, then what does that say about the rest of us? This wasn't about a chair. This was about an old system dressed up in new suits, the kind that uses words like discretion, operation necessity, or even random, to cover up what everyone in the room already knows. Racism in elite spaces doesn't always scream. It whispers. It comes in the form of a smirk, a condescending glance, or a hostess leaning in to say, "Sir, you'll need to move." It's humiliation disguised as policy. It's exclusion dressed as professionalism. And it sends the same chilling message. No matter how high you climb, some people will always try to push you back down. And that's the wound here. Because Marcus's money didn't shield him. His title didn't protect him. His power, hidden until the reveal, didn't stop them from humiliating him first. For those watching, the truth cut deep. Status won't always protect black dignity in spaces built on elitism. Now, let me ask you directly. Have you ever been judged before they even knew your name? Have you ever felt the sting of being dismissed, not for what you did, but for who you are? If so, then you know exactly why this moment matters. But here's where it gets even heavier. Marcus wasn't the only one who paid a price that day. The room itself had to face a question none of them were prepared for. Was this humiliation just an isolated mistake, or proof that racism still hides in every exclusive space we step into? And as the businessman sat there, his smirk beginning to fade, the answer was about to divide the room, and maybe even the audience watching now. The room had gone quiet, but the story was far from settled. For some, Marcus's calm power was inspiring. For others, it was unsettling. Because here's the truth. Not everyone in that lounge, and not everyone watching the story now, will agree on what just happened. Some people will argue the staff were just following policy. They'll use words like operation necessity or standard discretion. They'll say the hostess didn't mean harm, that she was only doing her job. They'll claim Marcus overreacted, that his firing was too harsh, that it wasn't about race at all. But let's be honest. If this wasn't about race, then why was a black man with a valid ticket the one asked to move? Why didn't the white businessman even hesitate before sliding into the seat? Why did the entire lounge freeze in silence instead of speaking up? This is where the controversy comes in, because some will defend the system, while others will call it what it looks like. Humiliation, plain and simple. And here's where you come in. Was this racism, or was it just power abuse hiding behind policy? I want to hear your answer. Comment below and tell me, which side are you on? Maybe you've seen this before. A so-called random decision that just happens to target the person of color in the room. A discretionary call that always seems to fall on the same group. Have you ever noticed that pattern? If so, you know it's not random at all. And that's the uncomfortable part. The debate doesn't just divide people in that lounge. It divides everyone who hears this story. Some will feel proud of Marcus. Some will feel threatened. And some will sit right in the middle, wondering what it says about the places they walk into every day. But here's the catch. Marcus wasn't finished. His move sparked more than whispers and debates. It forced the entire room to face a truth they couldn't dodge. And the silence that followed wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something bigger. Because what came next would turn that quiet lounge into a mirror for all of us. Tie Marcus's story to a collective experience. We've all seen silence in the face of racism, but silence is complicity. Build community around justice and awareness. Subscribe if you believe in hidden power and justice. The lounge that day was more than an airport waiting room. It became a mirror that showed how silence can sting almost as much as the words that push you aside. Think about it. Dozens of people sat in that room, eyes locked on Marcus, but not a single voice rose to say, "This isn't right." That silence, heavy and sharp, carried its own cruelty, and that's the part that cuts the deepest, because this isn't just Marcus's story. It's ours. We've all seen it. A black colleague talked over a meeting. A black traveler singled out at security, randomly, one too many times. A black student doubted before proving themselves. And what do most people do? They look down. They stay quiet. They wait for it to blow over. But silence is complicity. It's a choice that says, "I'm not part of the problem," while standing by as the problem grows louder. That day in the lounge, the humiliation didn't just belong to Marcus. It belonged to every person who sat in silence and let it happen. And here's where the power of community comes in. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're warnings. They're reminders. They're proof that racism doesn't disappear when someone earns a title, buys a ticket, or builds a fortune. It lingers, waiting for the next quiet nod of compliance to let it pass unchecked. So let me ask you, when you've seen something unfair, did you speak up? Or did you sit in silence, hoping someone else would? Drop your answer in the comments, because your voice matters here more than you think. And if you believe in hidden power and justice, if you believe that silence should never win, then this channel is for you. Subscribe now, not just for stories, but because every view, every comment, every voice we gather here builds community strong enough to call out what others try to ignore. Marcus's silence that day wasn't weakness. It was strategy, and it carried more weight than any shout could. But make no mistake, the room wasn't done watching and the world wasn't done questioning. Because the very next move Marcus made would leave everyone wondering if this was the end of the humiliation or just the beginning of a new fight. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. He didn't even need to say more than a few words. Yet everyone in that VIP lounge felt the power shift like an earthquake rolling through the room. The same man they dismissed, the same black CEO they tried to humiliate, had turned the whole moment upside down. Without shouting, without begging, without even explaining, Marcus Wright had forced the world to see him differently. But here's the thing most people miss. This wasn't just about one chair. It wasn't about a single white man in a gray suit who thought he owned the room. This was about how a system works, how racism can be dressed up in policies, in random decisions, in words like discretion and experience. That hostess didn't say, "We don't want you here." She said, "Sir, you'll need to move." Polite words, corporate words. But the impact? Brutal. Think about it. Marcus had every credential, every right, every dollar needed to be there. He had the badge. He had the boarding pass. He had the seat. And still, his dignity was questioned. If this can happen to one of the most powerful black CEOs in America, what does that mean for everyone else? For the young student trying to board a flight with financial aid papers in her backpack? For the father working 2 jobs, saving up for a first-ever vacation, only to be told he doesn't belong? Marcus's calm silence was not weakness. It was strategy. He knew the eyes were on him, but instead, he used silence as a weapon. He let the humiliation land, then flipped the entire script with one quiet message. That's the part that shook the room. He showed them that real power doesn't need to shout. And yet, the bigger truth is darker. Money and status don't erase racism. You can build empires, own companies, even invest in airlines, and still be told you don't belong. That's the reality Marcus exposed, not by speeches, but by action. Now I need to ask you, if this happened to you, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have spoken up? Would you have walked away to avoid the scene? Or would you have done what Marcus did? Waited, then showed your hidden power at the exact right time? Here's where the story cuts deeper. Some in that lounge will never admit they were wrong. Some will whisper that Marcus abused his power, Others will say he embarrassed the staff for no reason. And that's exactly why stories like this matter. Because racism doesn't only live in slurs or violence. It hides in subtle moments, in the smirk of a businessman, in the decision of a hostess, in the silence of a crowd too afraid to speak up. Marcus's story forces us to face that silence. It forces us to ask, who benefits when nothing is said? Who gets to stay comfortable when injustice is brushed off as operational necessity or random? Maybe you've been in that position before. Maybe not in a lounge, maybe not in first class, but in a classroom, at a job interview, in a store where the security guard followed you instead of the man next to you. Have you ever felt judged before you even open your mouth? That's why Marcus's one feels bigger than one seat. It's about reclaiming dignity in a world designed to strip it away. So let me leave you with this. Marcus didn't just fire people. He fired a system. He forced everyone in that room to look at him not as the exception, but as the rule. And maybe that's the scariest part for the people who watched it happen. Because once you've seen power redefined like that, you can't unsee it. Now it's your turn. Was this racism or just power abuse? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because this debate is bigger than one story. And if you believe these stories need to be told, if you believe silence can't be the answer anymore, then don't just watch. Subscribe. Join this community. Because ignoring these stories means letting them happen again, and none of us can afford that.